think your book is page 286. We're working for, what is the name of that company? Did it even tell us? I don't know what it did. You gathered the following data from the time cards and individual employee earning records. Your tasks are as follows. Prepare the payroll register, calculate the employer taxes, and then they gave you the 4 employees, what their allowances were and their marital status, their cumulative earnings before this pay period. That's how much they've earned up until December. The check number, the department that they work in, and then they gave us 5 bits of information. The other day I told you that you do not have to memorize those numbers nor those percents. I will give you those on the test. I don't want you to memorize those because payroll changes and there would be no reason for you to memorize that when we're going to have changes. I'd rather you memorize how to do the transactions and don't get so bogged down with what percent are we using. Our problem on the test, I'll give you this same bit of information. The numbers might be different, the percentages might be different, but I'll give you the information. The FICA OASDI is 6.2% on $106,800. Once the employee reaches $106,800 in their cumulative earnings, we're not going to calculate that anymore. Now let's say they're at $106,000 and for the next pay period they earn $1,000. We are still $800 short of making that wage base of $106,800. So for that pay period, if the earnings were $1,000, we still could calculate it on $800 of that $1,000. Now the numbers are not going to be as easy as that when you're calculating it on your problem. So $200 of that $1,000 we would not need to calculate the taxes on. The FICA Medicare is 1.45 on all earnings. The federal income tax is calculated from the table. It's figure 2. I don't remember what page it is in your book. I think it's different from my book. It's very small print. What page was it, Terrell?
265.
Okay, 265. The print is very tiny. Use your straight edge, use a piece of paper, use your name tent, something to help you keep on track with how we're calculating that. And when you look at the numbers for the earnings, it's going to say at least, but not more than, and we need to find that amount for the earnings for that pay period within that range. The state income tax, if we have a state income tax, did anybody look up to see whether my PowerPoint information was correct? Were those states correct? Terrell wondered if those were still the same states. Did you look it up? Maybe you'll look it up for Tuesday and tell us whether my PowerPoint's still accurate. But the state of Texas does not have a state income tax. If the problem tells you that we have a state income tax, then we'll calculate it. If it doesn't, we don't need to calculate it. But in the state of Texas, we do not have a state income tax. In this problem, it was 3% of the gross. And what do we mean by gross when we talk about pay? The total earnings before any withholdings. Okay, the total earnings. And then what is it called after we subtract all of the withholdings? The net pay. And that's the amount of your check, the net pay. We also had union dues of $18. And we had SUDA and FUDA. They gave us our percentages. It's 5.4%. The FUDA is 0.8% on earnings below $7,000. So once the employee reaches $7,000, we're not going to calculate that again. Is the FUTA and the SUTA on the payroll register? No. We can do the calculation down at the bottom, but why isn't it on the payroll register?
The employee doesn't pay it, the employer pays it.
Okay. The employee is not responsible for that, the employer is. Now, when we talk about the FICA, remember I told you the story about Northeast, the school districts in San Antonio. FICA has to be matched by the employer. Whatever we withhold from the employee's check has to be matched by the employer. It's a huge expense for businesses. And I think that's why the school district, Terrell, I think it already went down that way over here to Jennifer. Thank you. In the state of Texas, and I don't know whether it's true in other states or not, but teachers do not pay Social Security unless they're in San Antonio ISD, and they do. Right? The school districts in Texas did get a waiver years ago that they did not have to collect Social Security. And why? Why would they want that waiver? Andrew?
To remove the employer match.
Right.
Would be, given the scale of like any ISD, for instance, that would be tens of millions a year.
I don't know how much that would be a year. I don't even know how many employees they have now, but that is a lot of money. So they asked for that waiver, they got it, and they don't collect Social Security. They don't withhold that from the teacher's checks. It has to be matched. So when we talk about what we're going to withhold, we're going to have the FICA OASDI, the FICA Medicare, any other withholdings. It could be insurance, it could be parking, it could be union dues, whatever it tells us that we have. This one just has, was it insurance or what was it? It's union dues for $18. The SUTA and the FUTA will need our numbers from the payroll register to calculate that, because once that employee reaches $7,000, we won't calculate that anymore. And that $7,000 will be matched pretty early in the year. We'll make that. And then you won't be calculating the SUTA and the FUTA. When you're calculating the FUTA and it's 0.8%, you can change that to a decimal instead of a percent if you want. Just move the decimal to the left 2 places. And if it's 0.8%, remember that's going to be a very small number. It's not going to be a large number. So if it comes out and it's $500, know that you probably have the decimal in the wrong place because it's not a very big number. So the other day when we were working on it, I showed you that for the first person that we had, which was, thank you, Shereen, which is John Alvin. I did a little calculating just for John. I took the FICA, I wrote down my facts, what I had. The FICA was 6.2 on 106,800. The FICA Medicare was 1.45 on all earnings. You can also put these on the payroll register, so you don't have to keep referring to the problem information. The state income tax was $3,000 of the gross. Union dues was $18. SUTA rate, and then the FUTA rate, and just at $7,000. So once they meet $7,000, we're not calculating that anymore. The first step that we did, those of you that weren't here, you might just put those numbers in. We had 4 employees. Alvin, and I only have room for their last name. The pages are very small. Alvin, Gail, Malone, and Seaver. The next column has their marital status and their allowances. Then we had the cumulative earnings, and they gave us that number. We pointed out the other day the taxable earnings column, and there's two of them here for OASDI and Medicare, that is the amount of the earnings for that pay period that we're going to use as we calculate. It's not going to be the amount of the tax, it's the amount of the earnings that we used. The cumulative earnings after this pay period, we're going to take the cumulative earnings plus what we had in the gross, which would include the regular and the overtime, to come up with the cumulative earnings after this pay period. This column, when we get to the next month, becomes the numbers that we'll use here. Okay, the cumulative earnings before the next pay period. So this number will come here. It has to be the gross. Now, as we calculate our deductions, and you can see we had several, OASDI, the Medicare, the federal income tax, the state income tax, the union dues, there's not a total for your total deductions. You could write the name, or you could even put the total deductions over here. You've got enough space. I'd add those up, and if I were putting this in Excel, I would create a column that has the total deductions. Do you have to do this on paper? If you know Excel, if you're in the Excel class, apply what you've learned in Excel to calculate this. That's the only way some of our other classes are going to relate to what we're doing in here. If you know Excel, do it in Excel. Then we have our net pay, which is our cumulative minus what we withheld. They gave us our check number. And then the last two columns, if you'll just write up above that, this has to be your gross. This is the amount that we're going to use when we record the transaction. So this is the gross amount. And we have it divided, factory and office. The first person was Alvin. What kind of a worker was he? He was production. So he's going to go in the factory. So that's where we would put his right here. Would we have that on all companies? Maybe not. We might just have people that are working in the office, people that are in the field, our salespeople, the sales force. And it just wouldn't be labeled that way. That's why you will customize this, and hopefully you'll have a computerized system so that you're not having to do all of this by hand. This gets a little busy, and you can see the numbers, the places for the numbers are very tiny. So make sure your pencil sharpened so that you can get those numbers in there. When I grade it, you'll have your total at the bottom. You'll draw a single line and total all of the columns. I usually grade the totals first, and then if the totals don't come out with my key, then I go back and check your other numbers. So make sure you have your totals before you turn it in. And you can see I made a little notes there. 106,800, and that it was all of the earnings. I put the number here and the percent. We knew that the union dues was $18. You could put that number. You could even put the number all the way down for the 18. You know that. They gave that to you in the problem. Try not to have to flip back to the problem so many times. We did Alvin in class. There's the information that we have. This is Alvin. And then I'll push it up so you can see all of the numbers. You don't have to do a page like this for everybody. I did. I just wanted to see where my numbers came from. We had to round on, I think it was the Medicare. In your calculator, it should come up to 21.895. That's not a numeric number for a dollar amount. So we had to change the 895 to 90. It's 5 or more, you'll go up to the next number. Okay, so we're rounding. We don't ever round down, we just round up. If that were a 4 right here, what would the number be? Just 89. We just drop it. So if it's 5 or more, then we're going to go up. I also did the SUTA and the FUTA down there. It's paid by the employer. It doesn't go on the register. but we still need to know their earnings. Because if they're still under 7,000, we're going to be calculating it. So we have to know their earnings for the SUTA and the FUTA, but it does not go on the payroll register. So what does Alvin look like? And we did this one the other day. Those of you that weren't here, you can put those numbers in if you'd like, or leave it blank and calculate it later to see if you can come up with the numbers that we have. And it's very small. If you want to move up a little closer, that would be a good idea. We do have cents on the problems, which makes it even busier. All right, let's look at the next person, which is Nikki Gale. Nikki is single with one allowance. Cumulative earnings before this pay period, $47,500. Salary was $2,040. We're writing check number 31, and she's an office worker. The FICA OASDI is 6.2% on the $106,800. Is Nikki still within that range? Yes. She's not there yet, is she? All right. The federal income tax, we're going to be taking it from the table. The state income tax, what were the earnings? What's Nikki's earnings for the pay period? $2,040, and we need to calculate it on all of it. And then the union dues will be $18. So let's look at our calculations, and I'm going to have you calculate it so that you know what the numbers are. The OASDI, 2,040 times 6.2%. If you didn't get all of the numbers for Alvin, you can come up later and look at mine, those of you that weren't here. Don't be working on Alvin while we're working on Gail. The Medicare, we need to use the whole amount because the Medicare is calculated on all of the earnings. 2,040 times 1.45. The the federal income tax needs to come from our chart. The earnings were $2,040. See if you can find that. She was, I think everybody's single, and she had one allowance. The state income tax was 3% on the total earnings. And then the SUTA and the FUTA, they're not going to go on there, but is she under the 7,000 for the cumulative earnings? she's not, so we're not going to be calculating it on her. Who are we going to calculate the SUDA and the FUTA on? Only Paul. Paul Seaver. Everybody else is over the 7,000. There's the numbers that I have for Gail. And let's see what it looks like on the payroll register. Cumulative earnings before this pay period, 47,500. Regular earnings, 2,040. For the taxable earnings for the FICA, we're using the entire amount. They're still under 106,800. Cumulative earnings, I took the gross and added to the cumulative earnings before that pay period. What do you have for your FICA OASDI, the withholding? $126.48. Your Medicare. You have $29.58. $29.58. Okay. Your federal income tax came from the chart, $308. If you don't have the $308, you'll need to go back to the chart and make sure how you got off on that one, because that comes directly from the chart. The state income tax we needed to calculate, and on this one, I don't have my percentages up here, but on yours, when we wrote the percentages in on Tuesday, that helps, because I'm having to look back at my book to see what those percentages are. I only did it on that one page, but that helps so much if you will just put those percentages in. It will keep you from having to look at the problem again. So your state income tax should be $61.20. Union dues were $18 for everybody. And then for the net pay, I added up the deductions, came up to $543.26. I kept that number, and you could put that number just over here if you wanted to make another column so that you know what the total deductions are. In my accounting lab, is there a place for the total deductions, Cherise? Okay. I would just want that column. So if you were customizing that, and in Excel, I would put that column in, so you know how much you have withheld. Our net pay for Gail, $1,496.74. And Gail was an office worker. Remember, this amount is the gross, but we put it under office. And if you'll write gross above that column so you don't forget that that one's supposed to be gross. The next person is Malone. I did a calculation again. We're calculating the Medicare. There's the Malone name. We're calculating the OASDI and the Medicare on the total earnings. Yes.
Payroll for business, would this be cut in half? Because in the book there's like, it shows two.
I know.
Is that wrong?
Probably. Well, you could print it landscape in Excel and have it long. I think it's very difficult to read it when it goes to 2 pages. I know. Some of those columns you might want to hide, or you might want to make it smaller.
Because in the book it has one that's just.
I know it
just earnings,
does.
The other one has like food and all that.
Yeah. They just divided it because our page wasn't long enough. But in Excel, if you were printing it, I would just print it landscape so that you could see all of it. And you could print it on the legal size paper. think I'm the only one in the department that uses legal size paper. They have to order it just for me. That's why I like to get your envelope at the end of the class, because we won't use all of those worksheets and the payroll register, so I can reuse those. So on Malone, we have lots of calculating we need to do. I'm going to let you work on Malone, and then we'll check it. For Malone, what did you come up for the net amount of pay? Do you have it? $1,558.48. $1,558.48. Malone is a factory worker, so we'll put the gross amount, $2,080 over under factory. If you did not come up with your federal income tax of $282, go back to the chart and make sure that you read that chart correctly. Because we have to look at that it's less than, not more than, and find that amount for the earnings. Cumulative earnings, what total do you have for Malone after this pay period? Cumulative earnings after this pay period. Okay, 66,880. And that number, once again, becomes the cumulative earnings, try to say that fast 3 times, for the next pay period. All right, we have Seaver to do next. OASDI 6.2, and Seaver's earnings were $810. Medicare is on the total amount, and Seaver is still under the 106,800, correct? With the earnings. Medicare 1.45 on the 810. Federal income tax, single with 1 allowance. What form did Seaver have to fill out so that we know that it's 1 allowance? The W-4. Before you can work, you have to fill out the W-4. That's the easiest way to remember it. What do you get at the end of the year that lists your total earnings? Your W-2. The state income tax was 3%. Union dues, $18. Plug your numbers in for Seaver, and then I'd like for you to total your payroll register, and then we're going to check your totals. So you should have 4 employees, and then lots of totals down at the bottom. Total these already? Okay. That is the first thing that I will grade will be your totals, and then check other things if the totals don't come out. Okay, good. Did you get the first one?
She got 17. Yeah, so we just have that. I think I'll put it.
Well, I'm not switched. This number is your gross, but this is the amount that we're going to expense. So you have these, but this number should be here. I have Seavers up there if you want to check that. Mine seems really small because, look, I reduced mine to a regular sheet of paper. So no wonder why mine is so small. When I get ready to grade, this is what I'll be looking for, just your totals. I don't know whether you can even see those from back there. Your cumulative earnings should be $154,300. Regular pay, $6,440. Gross is the same amount. Under taxable earnings, it should be the same amount, $6,440. Under Medicare, $6,440. Cumulative earnings after this pay period, $160,740. We good so far? OASDI FICA, $399.28. Medicare, $93.39. What's the FIT? Who has it? $796. The SIT, $193.20. Union dues, $72. And what is our net pay? Who's got it? Andrew, do you have it?
4886.13.
Okay, $4,886.13. Factory workers total,
3,590.
that's it. And the office workers total,
2,850.
$2,850. Now, if you really wanted to double check yourself before you turn it in, all of your numbers across should equal 2 if you subtract all of your withholdings, bless you, from that gross amount. It should equal your net amount, your net pay. So you can double check yourself if you want to, or wait until you turn it in and I'll check your totals. All right? It's just a lot of adding, and it's a lot of calculating before we get to add up our totals. You can do the sheets like I had if you want to on each one. You can just do it on your calculator and then plug those numbers in, or you can put it in Excel. Now we have 2 other amounts that we needed to look at, and that was FUTA and SUTA. Remember, the wage base is $7,000 for FUTA and SUTA. So once our employees reach $7,000 in their cumulative earnings, we don't need to calculate that again. So let's look at our cumulative earnings before this payroll. Is there anyone that is still under $7,000? Seaver is. And Seaver had earnings of $4,600, and then this pay period made $810. Are they still under the $7,000? All right. If they were not still under the $7,000 and let's say went over by $10, we could only use 800 of that 810. And I'm just picking random numbers to make it seem a little easier. It wouldn't be that simple when you're calculating it to see whether they're under the 7,000. We just want to use the portion of their pay for this pay period to make it to the 7,000. So Seaver's the only one, and Seaver earned $810. So I calculated the FUTA, 810 times 0.8%. The wage base was 7,000. And then for the SUTA, it was 810 times the 5.4%. And just put those numbers down at the bottom of your payroll register. You'll need those later when we record our transactions. The wage base was 7,000 on both of those. And that was just the page that I used to come up with the SUTA and the FUTA. The employer amounts of the tax. The employer is responsible for matching what we withheld from our employees for the FICA, OASDI, and the FICA Medicare. I think our payroll register shows $399.28. And we have a little problem on the Medicare. My key is off by a penny because I have 93.39 on my key, but I think our payroll register shows 93.38 when you added that up, didn't it? Is it not? Is it 39? I don't know. We were off a penny when we did this problem last semester. Does yours say 93.39 or 93.38?
If I take 6,400.
I know. My key has 93.39. So when we get ready to do our entries, we're going to use my payroll register that I copied. I'll give that to you on Tuesday when we continue with Chapter 8, because we're going to continue with this problem through Chapter 8. So I've made a copy of my key that shows that 1 penny added in. I don't know where it is, and I thought, I'm not looking for a penny.
Well, if you take the Medicare amounts.
I know, but my key to continue the problem with the transaction is wrong. So I don't know which number was wrong. But we'll use mine on Tuesday next week to continue with 8. So I just calculated what that amount is going to be for the employer. The employer has to match the FICA OASDI, the FICA Medicare, and is responsible for the FUTA and the SUTA. Right? The employer does not have to pay that. Miriam, can you direct the camera over here? This is not in your book. It's not in your notes anywhere, but I'd like for you to put this on the back of that payroll register or in your notes somewhere. This will help you when we're trying to figure out what transactions we're going to have to do with payroll. Payroll at times, I think, can seem rather difficult, but if you'll just remember the transactions that we need to perform after we do the payroll register. Really, I think the payroll register is the easiest part, because they give you the numbers, they give you the percentages, and all you have to do is calculate that. But we have several transactions that we're going to do, and you'll need to pay attention to the word record, transfer, pay, and pay. Now, the ones that we're going to use cash for will be the last three: transfer, pay, and pay. To record, all we're doing is putting it in the journal. So the first transaction we're going to do, can you see it, Sharice, or am I standing right in the way? Okay. The first transaction we will record in Chapter 8, and please read Chapter 8 over the weekend before we meet on Tuesday, is going to be to record the payroll. The information that we have on the payroll register is what we will use to record the payroll. We'll have our gross amount. We'll have all of our deductions, whether it's union dues, insurance, whatever taxes we've withheld, and then we'll have our net pay. The net pay plus all of the deductions will equal the gross. The gross is coming from the last two columns on that payroll register, where we used the gross amount and it told us it was factory. What was the other one? And office, I think. Production and office. Those are the expenses. That's the gross amount. All of the withholdings plus the net pay will equal that gross amount. That's the first transaction. Record the payroll. Cash is not involved. We're just recording it. The second transaction will be to record the payroll taxes. Who is responsible for the payroll taxes? The employer. What payroll taxes will the employer pay? FICA, OASDI, FICA Medicare, FUTA, and SUTA. And we could have workers' compensation if we had to pay that. I don't know that any of our problems have that. Whatever taxes the employer is responsible for. Now, we can get two of those numbers from this transaction, can't we? The FICA OASDI and the FICA Medicare. The employer has to match what we withheld from the owner's check, or not the owner's, the employee's check. Have to match it. Remember the school districts, they don't want to pay Social Security because it's a huge expense. They have to match it.
So do you journalize that as an expense? Or do you journalize it?
They're all payables. It'll be payroll tax expense, and then everything else is a payable. Because it's a liability until we pay it, isn't it? And we'll get to that in 8. We'll look at the accounts that we're going to be using. But they're all payables when we collect them. We're just the keeper of that for a while until we pay it. Okay, so it's a liability. It's not any money that we get to keep, that we've withheld from the employees' checks. So the second one is to record the payroll taxes. This is employer. Is cash involved in this one? No. We're just recording them. Okay? Now, if we were going to post this transaction and this transaction in the FICA OASDI and the FICA Medicare, we're going to have the same amount posted in there 2 times, aren't we? One for the employee, one for the employer. The third transaction is to transfer cash to the payroll cash account. Most businesses do not use their regular cash account for payroll. If you'll just transfer the amount of your checks, which would be the net pay, into an account called payroll cash, once everybody's check is cashed or once everybody's deposit is made, because it could be electronically calculated and submitted to those employees, then that account is going to be zero. Let's say someone lost their check for $550. Once everyone has cashed their checks or the deposits have been made, the balance in that payroll cash account should be $550 because somebody lost their check. Makes it easier to reconcile that bank statement. It also gives you another checks and balances because we don't want the same person reconciling the bank statement that's writing the checks. We're putting the exact amount into the payroll checking account that our net pay is going to be. So that's the third transaction. Cash is involved in this one. It's going to be a debit to payroll cash and a credit to cash. That transaction is not in your book anywhere. There's no example of it. They talk about it, but they didn't give you an example of what that looks like. So a debit to payroll cash, a credit to cash. We're just transferring money. The next transaction, which would be the fourth one, is to pay the payroll. Payroll cash is going to be our credit, and our debit is going to be salaries payable. That comes back from this transaction. Now, we haven't looked at those transactions yet, but you'll see them when you read Chapter 8.
I'm sorry, what is it?
Pay the payroll,
Salaries payable.
wages, salaries payable, however it's listed, would be our debit. Payroll cash would be our credit. And then our last transaction will be to pay the taxes. When we pay, that's a credit to cash. If we're paying state income tax, if we're paying federal income tax, if we're paying FUTA and SUTA, some of those we can combine, but we can't pay the state income tax and the federal income tax in the same check. They're going to different places. So we'll look at those transactions in 8 on how we're going to pay. Also with the SUTA and the FUTA, we don't have to make that payment every month if we have a good record and we haven't laid off our workers. If we have a good credit rating with our SUTA and FUTA, we may not have to be a monthly payer for those 2 taxes. Okay, so that's sort of a reward that we get if we keep our employees employed. So we have how many transactions? 5. Now, on this test, when you take this test, I think this is the easiest test that you have. It's the hardest 2 chapters, but it's the easiest test. If you'll read what I've written for the instructions, and some of you will read too much into it, and you'll just read too much into it. So let's just look at what we have to do first. We're going to do that payroll register. That just takes a lot of time, but it's not hard, is it? We have to look at the wage base, write all that information on the payroll register that you can take from the problem so you're not looking back and forth. Be neat, be careful when you add, round correctly, and then put your totals at the bottom. You have to have your totals, even on your homework. Then we're going to record the payroll. That transaction comes from the payroll register. We'll have the gross. The gross will equal the withholdings or the allowed deductions plus the net pay. All those numbers come from the payroll register. The second one is to record the payroll taxes. Employee, employer. The employer is responsible for FICA OASDI, FICA Medicare, FUTA SUTA, and possibly workers' comp. All we're doing is recording. There's no cash involved in that. The third one is to transfer the amount that we need for the payroll into the payroll checking account. It's the net amount. That comes from the payroll register. Transfer the money, pay the payroll. We're going to pay it out of the payroll cash, and then we're going to pay the taxes. It's not that hard, but you have to remember what we have to do first and when we're going to have cash involved. After we record these two and we post them, then the amount that we have in those payable tax accounts, especially for the FICA, OASDI, and the FICA Medicare, is going to be the same amount twice. Exact amount twice. Pay the payroll, pay the taxes. If you didn't read 7, go back and read 7. Go back and read the key points at the end of the chapter, and then read 8. This is a little introduction to 8 before we meet on Tuesday. Any questions that you can ask? That I know some of you have questions. Payroll is not the easiest thing to learn. We're going to cover it in 2 chapters, 2 weeks, and there's a class that is just payroll. And I got a catalog the other day for some new books, and there were about 15 new books coming out on payroll. So you'll take payroll for your accounting technology degree, you'll take a payroll class when you're working on your bachelor's degree, and then they had graduate level payroll books. Payroll is constantly changing. Those numbers are changing, the withholdings were changing. They changed 2 years ago with calculating what was withheld from the check for the employees, but the employers were paying a higher percent. I never changed it with the book. I just let it match, just because we've gone back to it matching again. It was kind of an incentive for workers that their take-home pay was a little bit larger for a year. Not much, but it was a little larger. Terrell, do you have a question?
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
So if you're like account doing payroll, is there like some kind of, how do you know when those changes happen?
How do you know?
Percentages changes. Do you have to just find out yourself? Or?
No. Were you here when I was talking about the accounting book that comes with the real thin pages? I think I talked about it on Tuesday, that we used to have to file for my dad. They came several times a week. We get a package of changes, and they'd have to be filed. Now that's all computerized. It's a website. He pays for that service, and he gets a blurb, an email blast that says, here's the latest change. There's changes that go with how much, especially with estate planning, that type of thing, you've really got to be up on the current tax laws for that. How much money a parent can give to a child every year. I think that's gone up. It used to be like $5,000. Now I think it's gone up to 10. And then the child doesn't have to pay the tax on that, and it's a write-off for the parent. Those are ever changing. Those are just, you just have to stay on top of that. If you're working in the accounting field as a CPA or a financial planner, you'd have to subscribe to that so that you get those changes.
Don't
You just would.
have to go to like continuing education?
Oh, they do.
classes?
Right.
Tax preparers have to go?
Right, but it doesn't have to just be a tax class that you're taking. It could be an accounting software class. It could be any type of continuing ed that goes along with accounting. Even a new program. As long as you have those CEUs. And you have to have those every year. And sometimes those are hard to get. I have to have CEUs for a certification that I have in court reporting, and there's not always classes here to take to get those CEUs. So it's real hard to get it. I know the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People could count for that, but I already took it. And it has to be after you're certified that you count those CEUs, so I can't count that. So anytime there's something offered in your field when you're working, go so that you can get those CEUs. Some things are free, some things you have to pay for.
And some
Andrew.
employers, if you're not working for yourself, you're working for somebody else, some employers will have their own CE programs.
Right.
Well, they're provided through providers that they have a contract with, and that's always an option as well. They could basically just be kind of just like, here, do this.
Do the training, yeah. I know I've seen my dad work on something at the end of the year, something that he ordered online that he could take a course and take the test and get so many CEUs. Yeah. Any other questions? We covered a lot today, but please go back and read 7 again, look at those key points, and then read chapter 8. We still have a little bit of time, so I think you've got to hang on to that. Hang on to your journal. I probably should have given that to you already. Hang on to your payroll register. I don't want us to start 8 until you have a chance to read that and to do your questions, but I can get the Peachtree started. Who still needs to do Peachtree? Sharon, Andrew, you do, Sharice. Why don't we move to the back? Tara, are you working on something on the computer? Would you mind moving up to the front and we'll just move back there? Who else needed to do Peachtree? Bella, you do. You weren't here. Rebecca, you did it, didn't you? I think that was all. Okay. And I think I'll still record it. Can you turn this off there, Mary?